Welcome to From Barter to Fiat and Crypto. What we're going to be doing in these few videos is to understand cryptocurrency and actually what cryptocurrency is. And my aim is to show you why cryptocurrency is merely a natural extension of the currency that you and I use today. And in order to do that, we're going to go back in history and look at the past history of currency. Look at how we got to today before we look at why crypto actually represents a strong part of the future. So in terms of the objectives, we're going to look at what money actually is. We're going to look at the barter economy up to fiat. We're then going to look at fiat currencies in a little bit more detail, understand what we mean by the word fiat currency and why it's based on trust. We're going to look at how commercial banks create more money through a process called fractional reserving. We're going to look at how central banks create more money through a process called quantitative easing. And then we're going to look at the implications of this monetary creation by both the commercial banks, but more importantly, by the central banks. And then we're going to look at why we think that fiat is naturally moving in the direction of cryptocurrency. My name is Ted Wainman. I have a background as an accountant and at JP Morgan, but since 2003 I've been designing, developing and delivering training workshops. I've worked with over 300 companies in over 35 countries around the world. With a background in finance, I do a lot around financial analysis, and I also look at strategic thinking and planning. And what really resonates with me is the fact that whenever we look at a financial company's statements, we talk in dollars or in yen, in pounds, in sterling, in dirham, real, but we never really spend a lot of time thinking, what does that actually mean? A dollar, what is the value of a dollar? What does a dollar actually mean? And that's what we're going to do in this workshop. We're actually going to get underneath the skin of a currency and find out what is a dollar actually worth. So let's start off thinking about what is money. And in order to think about what is money, we got to go way, way, way back in time, all the way back to the barter economy. Now, the barter economy is really about you having something that I want at the same time that I have something that you want. So, for example, I'm walking down the street, I've got a chicken under my arm, I bump into you, you have a fish under your arm, I feel like having fish tonight, you feel like having chicken tonight, we can do a straight swap. And that's fine, as long as you've got what I want at the same time that I've got what you want. Maybe you don't want chicken tonight, maybe you want somebody to paint your front door. So I've now got to go and find somebody who will paint your front door in exchange for a fish, and then I can exchange them the fish for the chicken, for example. And it becomes really, really complicated. And there have been studies, examples of people trying to create a simple pencil or a simple toaster and trying to do it through the barter, or actually getting to the raw materials, for example. So even something as simple as a pencil with the covering, for example, actually putting the lead in there is very, very complicated and requires materials from all over the world. And this is what Adam Smith talked about when he talked about his invisible hand. You do what you're good at, I'll do what I'm good at, and then we'll trade. The problem is we need something to trade with. We need a currency. So I've decided that in our economy, we're going to use tomatoes. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, hold on a sec, Ted, I don't think that's a very good idea because tomatoes would not be a very good currency, you'd be absolutely right. And the reason that tomatoes are not a good currency is that they don't fulfill the 4 key criteria we look for from a currency. And here are those 4 key criteria. So the first one is creation. We need something that cannot be created and cannot be destroyed. And the problem with tomatoes is it's very easy to create them. So, for example, if you want a pay rise, rather than working harder and persuading your boss to give you a pay rise, you could just go into the garden and grow more tomatoes. And you can destroy tomatoes by throwing them at your friends, for example. Application, what we talk about application is industrial application. So can I use my tomatoes for anything else? And the answer is, well, yes, I can. Tomatoes are actually quite useful. I like to have them on my salad, and my kids eat the most phenomenal amount of tomato ketchup made with tomatoes. Tomatoes do not actually act as a good store of wealth. They're not a very good store of wealth. If I'm saving up for my summer holiday, for example, if I'm saving up and I'm putting tomatoes in a basket underneath my bed, when it comes to the time to pay for my summer holiday, what I end up with is actually a big soggy mass of tomatoes. So they don't act as a store of wealth. And finally, tomatoes are not really homogeneous. They're not divisible. So, for example, you can have big tomatoes and small tomatoes, ripe tomatoes, unripe tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, green tomatoes. And if I buy something from you that costs half a tomato, then I'm going to cut it in half, and the other half I put in my pocket, and I end up with rather soggy, messy trousers. So if tomatoes are not a good currency, then the question is, what will make a good currency? And hopefully you're a little bit ahead of me on this one, and you've already thought, hang on a sec, I know, gold. That's the obvious one. Let's just double check against our criteria. Gold cannot be created. It's a naturally occurring element that appears on the periodic table. You can mine it, but you can't create it, despite what you read in The Alchemist. It's industrially useless. Now, I know you'll find it in a little bit of electronics, but the point I'm making there is that industrial demand does not affect the price of gold, unlike the price of silver, which does have a much wider industrial application. Gold is a very good store of wealth. That gold bar that sank on a Spanish ship thousands of years ago is still there at the bottom of the sea. It doesn't rust away, it doesn't erode. Okay, so gold is a really good store of wealth. And finally, gold is homogeneous. A gold bar is a gold bar is a gold bar, as long as it's the same purity. And you can have gold bars and gold coins and gold dust, so it's very, very divisible as well. And this homogeneous element lends to what we call fungibility. And fungibility means that if I give you one gold bar and I lend it to you, for example, you don't have to give me exactly that gold bar. You can give me another gold bar in return, as long as it's obviously of the same size and purity. Okay, so fungibility means that it can be swapped for one which is the same, if that makes sense. That's different to a car. If I lend you my car, I expect to get my car back. So gold becomes a really good commodity. The problem is that gold isn't really very practical. So if, for example, I want to buy a cup of coffee from Starbucks, if I go to Starbucks, I really depend on them having a very accurate pair of scales, so that as I'm measuring out my gold dust, we get exactly the right quantity. And then just as I'm about to buy my coffee, the chap standing behind me in the queue sneezes, and the gold dust goes absolutely everywhere. So it's not really very practical. And if I want to buy a car from you, perhaps you've got a Bugatti Veyron for sale, and I want to buy it from you, and I'm going to need 2 gold bars. What happens is I put them in my pocket, my trousers fall down, because 2 gold bars is pretty heavy. So as gold isn't really very practical, and I don't actually have any gold with me, but what I do have is the next best thing, which is an ounce of silver. So here's my ounce of silver. This isn't really very practical, so I need somebody who's going to look after it until I actually need it. So I have a friend of mine who has a very big safe, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to deposit my gold with my friend. So here we go. I take my 2 gold bars, I give them to my friend, and he gives me in return 2 of these pieces of paper that says that he owes me a gold bar. So here we go, there's my 2 pieces of paper. I've got my 2 pieces of paper saying that they owe me a gold bar, and any time I want, I can come and see him and say, oi, you owe me those gold bars. So if I'm going to buy, for example, the car from you, and here are the Bugatti car keys, what I need to do is to go and see my friend who has the gold bars. I exchange the IOU for the gold bars, so I now have the gold bars. I come and see you, I give you the gold bars, and you give me the keys to your car. What do you do with those 2 gold bars? Well, obviously what you do is you deposit them with our friend who gives you the piece of paper, and this is quite a long-winded process for me to end up with the keys to the car and you to end up with the two IOU, the two pieces of paper. So wouldn't it be a much easier process, go back to the beginning, wouldn't it be a much easier process if we just swap? I give you the two pieces of paper and you can go and see this person if you want, and you give me the keys to the car. And what we see here is the birth of paper currency. So this is effectively a paper currency and it's backed by gold, or in my example silver. Okay, so it's backed by gold. Here we go. Now, this is fantastic because this means that we can actually start trading. It's much, much easier. So we can now rely on this paper currency. We've got these two IOUs. We're trading them around our economy. They're backed by gold. Okay, don't forget that. Anytime you want, you can go and see our friend. He's down there and he's got the gold bars. But we don't need to, because I know that you'll accept the pieces of paper in exchange for goods and services to the value of, well, in our example, one gold bar. And so actually nobody goes to see him. We see our economy, which is, we're trading, and nobody goes to see this person who has the gold bars, and then we kind of forget which street the gold bars are on, and did they ever exist, and maybe it's a little bit mythical. And so the person who owns the gold bar decides to try an experiment. And what he does is he takes the two gold bars off the table and replaces them with one gold bar. Now, what effect does that have on the economy? Well, the answer is nothing. And the reason it has no effect on the economy is that we're still using these pieces of paper. We now trust these pieces of paper that we're trading around our economy. We don't even know where this person's gold shop is. And in 1971, Nixon took this to its logical conclusion, performed the ultimate financial experiment when he delinked from the gold standard. And so we end up today with one of these, which is a dollar bill, and on the back it says "In God We Trust," and it is backed by nothing. It's what's known as a fiat currency. Fiat, literally from the Latin, let it be done. Nothing to do with the car company. So today we have fiat currencies in circulation. This is a currency which is backed by the promise of the government who issued it. Nothing more than that. There's no physical asset sitting behind it, and you will accept this in exchange for goods and services to the value of $1, because you believe that you can pass it on to somebody else somewhere else in the world in exchange for goods and services to the value of $1. This has implicitly no value. It's a piece of paper with pretty pictures on it. In fact, it's a piece of cotton with pretty pictures on it, nothing more. Okay, this is a fiat currency. So a fiat currency is a currency that is backed by no physical asset. And here we have examples of lots and lots and lots of fiat currencies. So these are the currencies that I picked up on my travels to 35 countries around the world. And some of them are worth quite a lot, and some of them are worth a lot less, okay, in terms of spending power. But these are fiat currencies. Now I want to share with you just a few specific fiat currencies. So the first one we've looked at already is the dollar bill, and on the back it says "In God We Trust." Now this is issued by the US government. When it says "In God We Trust," you'll notice it doesn't mention which God we trust. It's issued by the US government, and it is effectively an IOU by the US government. So right now I have this piece of paper. The US government owes me $1. And when I come and see you and you have a banana, or for example, and you want to sell that banana or bunch of bananas to me for $1, effectively what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, the US government owes me $1. I'd quite like those bananas. Why don't I give you this, which means that the US government owes you $1, and you give me the bananas, and then you can then take this dollar and have the same conversation with somebody else, etc., etc., etc. So that's why this currency works. Okay, now I'm speaking from here in the UK. So let's have a look at a bit of UK currency. So here we have a £5 note. Now this is actually an old £5 note. This is no longer a legal tender here in the UK, but on your screen you'll see a new £5 note. And what's interesting about this one is it says across the top of the Bank of England, and if you look carefully underneath the Bank of England, you can see in very small print it says, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5," and it's signed by the chief cashier of the Bank of England. Now you can take this is effectively a IOU by the UK government. You can take this into any bank and you can hold it up to the window and you can say, "Oi, you owe me £5, I want my £5," and you slip it under the window and the teller on the other side will look you slightly quizzically and give it back to you, because they will say this is £5. Okay, once again, exactly like the dollar, the UK government owes me £5 and I can swap this with somebody else and say, look, why doesn't the UK government owe you £5 and you give me that bunch of bananas, for example. Okay, there's our pounds. Next one I want to talk about is this one here. So this is a Scottish pound note. Okay, now this is legal tender here in England, but they don't really like it. So if I go and visit my brother-in-law up in Scotland, I tend to collect a few of these and then I try to pay taxi drivers down here in the UK, in London, and they get very shirty about it. But this is legal tender. Now, once again, this says in the very small writing, if you can see very carefully on your screen, it says the Royal Bank of Scotland promises to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10 at their head office here in Edinburgh. Okay, now this is an important distinction. Okay, so this is issued by the Bank of England. The Bank of England is the oldest central bank in the world. 1694 it was founded, but it was nationalised in 1946. So it is effectively a government-owned, government-controlled entity. RBS is not. RBS is a publicly limited company. It's what's known as a private bank. But the Royal Bank of Scotland is issuing its own banknotes. Now, in 2007-2008, during the global financial crisis, Royal Bank of Scotland went bust. And if the Royal Bank of Scotland had gone bust, then this would have had no value. Because if you turned up at their head office in Edinburgh, you'd have found an empty building with a "gone out of business" sign across the front door. So you'd have said, well, hold on a sec, nobody owes me this money. And therefore the UK government had to step in and bail out the Royal Bank of Scotland. Okay, so this has value as long as the entity, whether it's a government or central bank or a private bank, as long as that entity is still solvent and still there. If it's no longer there, then this has no value. People lose faith in it. Okay, that's our first lesson. Now, I also want to show you these two banknotes here. Okay, so these two are two €5 banknotes, and I want you to look very carefully and see if you can notice the difference. Now, I can tell you now that neither of them is a counterfeit, so it would be illegal for me to own counterfeit money. Okay, so they are both perfectly valid. They've got the watermark, etc., etc. So they're perfectly legal tender. And you might be sitting there saying, well, Ted, I can't tell any difference. And you'd be right, these are fungible. If I lend you this one and you give me back this one, it doesn't really matter which one. You know, they're exchangeable, they're fungible. But what you cannot see, and what I can see, is the serial number printed on the back. And the last letter of the serial number indicates the central bank that issued this currency. And the top one ends with an X, that's issued by the Central Bank of Germany. And the bottom one, it ends in a Y and it's issued by the Central Bank of Greece. Why should I care, you might ask? Well, that's a perfectly fair question. But during 2011 to 13, the European debt financial crisis, when Greece was really struggling to refinance its debt, there was a possibility that Greece was going to get kicked out of the EU and kicked out of the euro. And there were rumours that said, well, if Greece is going to exit the euro, then they're no longer going to back any euro notes issued by the Central Bank of Greece. Why would they? They'll just say, well, we don't do that anymore. We have the drachma. So why would we want to bother with the euro? And therefore, there were rumours that said that if you own one of these, it will become worthless because it's issued by the Central Bank of Greece and Greece is no longer in the euro. The reality doesn't matter, by the way. It's all about the rumours, because as soon as you start to hear these rumours, then there are rumours that shops in and around the Eurozone say, well, we will not accept a euro note that ends in Y, but we will accept a euro note that ends in X. So now you might ask yourself, if I was to offer you these, which one would you rather have? Well, logically, you'd rather have the X that you know you can exchange for goods and services to the value of €5, rather than taking a risk with the Y, because there's a possibility that the person on the other side of the trade will not accept it in exchange for goods and services to the value of €5. And this shows us effectively the problem with fiat currency. It works until it doesn't work. As long as you have faith in this, as long as the other party has faith in it, it works as a very good medium of exchange. And we know it works because we use it day to day. But as soon as it fails, as soon as it stops working, effectively it collapses. It has no value, and we end up with holding a piece of paper with pretty pictures on it, which has no value. So now we've learnt actually what we mean by fiat currency. And by the way, every currency in the world today is a fiat currency. So now we've worked that out, let's look at how commercial banks create additional money. And they do this through what's called a process of fractional reserving. Now, the best way to describe fractional reserving is by an example, but before we do that, let's make sure we understand what we mean by money. So earlier we've been talking about the dollar, for example, and we understand that this is money, but this physical currency is becoming less and less of the currency which is in circulation in our societies. So if I put this in my current account, it's still money. And if I put it in my savings account or my deposit account, it's still money. But at some point, it no longer becomes money. Maybe it becomes an investment. So if I invest it in a share in Facebook, for example, then that's clearly not money. That's an investment. That's completely different. And so what we do is we often talk about cash and near cash, or cash equivalents. And these are different definitions of money, and I've given you the two definitions here in the UK that I want to refer to. M0 is the actual physical notes and coins, but this is an increasingly smaller part of the economy. M4 is a much better way of describing the broader money supply, and that includes the deposit accounts and savings account and current accounts of individuals and financial institutions and companies, etc., etc. So here's the way fractional reserving works. Adam starts off with $1,000. So here we've got a nice simple economy, and we've just got $1,000. So 1,000 of these things, $1,000 in our economy, and they're owned by Adam. Adam takes his $1,000 and he deposits it at the bank. Now the bank has to put a fraction, hence the word fractional reserve. The bank has to put a fraction, and in our example, that's $100 on one side, and that's just in case that Adam wants to make a withdrawal, use an ATM machine, etc. Okay, so the bank puts some of the money on one side and then lends the other $900 to Ben, and Ben, with his $900, goes out into the world and he decides to buy whatever it is he wants to buy from Charlie, okay, for $900. So at the end of this first transaction, if we ask how much money is in the economy, Adam will say, I've got $1,000 on deposit at the bank, and here's my bank statement showing me. And Charlie will say, well, I've got $900 in cash, and here it is. And so in our economy, we've now got $1,900. We've created additional money in the economy effectively out of thin air. Charlie then takes his $900 and he deposits it at the bank. The bank puts $90 on one side, that's 10% of Charlie's money, and lends the $810 out to Dave, and Dave buys whatever it is he wants to buy from Ed for $810. So how much money in our economy now? Well, Adam's got $1,000 on deposit, Charlie has got $900 in his current account, and Edward has got $810 in cash. There's a total of $2,710 in our economy. And once again, Edward takes his $810, he deposits at the bank. The bank puts $81 on one side, lends the other $729 to Freddie, who buys whatever it is he wants to buy for $729 from George. How much money in the economy? Adam's got $1,000, Charlie's got $900, Ed's got $810, all on deposit in the bank. All of them have bank statements to prove that. And George has got $729 in cash. There's a total of $3,439 in our economy when we started with only $1,000. Okay, now This gives the central bank, and therefore the government, a very important monetary tool. Because what the central bank could do is to say, well, rather than putting 10% on one side, we'd only want you to put 5% on one side. What effect does that have on the economy? Well, the answer is that it's inflationary. Now, let's look at why that works. Okay, so first of all, if the bank only has to put 10% on one side, then they can, in the first instance, they only have to put $50 on one side of Adam's deposit rather than $100, and therefore they can lend out $950, which means that it creates more money in the economy. Okay, so what effect does more money in the economy have? Well, in order to answer that question, we use a very simple formula. Here it is, and I apologize if you get nervous by formulae, but this is quite an easy one, and it really says that the quantity of money in the economy, that's the money supply, in our example M4, multiplied by the velocity of money, and the velocity of money means the speed at which it's moving around our economy. So if you think about your personal circumstances, you get paid on this day, you pay out your rent here, you buy some food here, you go to the cinema there, you put a little bit away, and then you get paid again, and then you rinse and repeat. So there's a sort of a rhythm to the way that we receive and spend money. It has a velocity that it passes through our wallet, and it's usually pretty constant. So the velocity of money is, generally speaking, a constant in our equation here. So the amount of money and the speed at which it moves around our economy is a function of the price times the quantity of goods and services. So let's imagine that you have a rich uncle in America and you didn't know about it, and just out of the blue your rich uncle phones you up and says, I'm going to gift you $1 million, and you're feeling pretty pleased with yourself at that. And you've decided to invest, and I use the word advisedly, in a Ferrari. So here's our $1 million Ferrari that we're going to buy. Okay, what effect would your purchase of that Ferrari have on the worldwide price of Ferraris? Well, before we get ahead of ourselves, we have to remember that if you go and buy a Ferrari in your local town, it doesn't mean that the price of Ferraris in New York, for example, is going to go up, because you can't move markets. But what if everybody received a check for $1 million from their rich uncle in America, and everybody decided to go out and buy Ferraris? Ferraris have two choices. One, they could increase production, that's the Q, in order to satisfy demand, or two, they could put the price up. Well, Ferrari have a limited amount of production, and actually part of the desirability of Ferraris is the fact that they don't make that many each year. So the Q in our example is constant, okay? And therefore, if we increase the M, the only thing that we can increase on the other side is the P. And therefore, what we see is increasing the money supply is inflationary and causes prices to rise. And conversely, decreasing the money supply, sucking money out of the economy, is deflationary. Okay, so what we now understand is the effect of the increase in the money supply by commercial banks. And if commercial banks, if they reduce the fraction they hold in reserve, it increases the money supply in the economy. And in theory, looking at our equation here, in theory, if you increase the money supply, it will have an inflationary effect on your economy. So we've seen how commercial banks can create additional money in the economy through this process called fractional reserving. And if you want to see what $10,000 looks like in $100 bills, there it is. And $100,000 in $100 bills is a small pile of money. $1 million in $100 bills is basically about a meter cubed. $1 billion, quite a bit bigger. And $1 trillion, well, $1 trillion in $100 bills is effectively going to cover a US football field to the height of 2 meters. That's quite a lot of money. So, what's the debt of the United States of America? Well, you might be saying, well, I have no idea. Why should I know that? Well, there's no reason why you should. But if you look at the US debt clock, which is available online, you will see that at the time of recording this video, by the time you watch it, it will have increased. It was $27.6 trillion. $27.6 trillion. That's a huge amount of money. That's enough money in $100 bills to cover 27.5 US football fields to the height of 2 meters. It's a figure so large that if you were to repay the debt of the United States at the rate of $1 per second, it would take you more than 500,000 years, which is an academic number because the debt is increasing at a rate of greater than $1 per second. That's a lot of money. So who owns all that US debt? Who's the biggest lender to the US? You might be thinking, I know the answer to that one, Ted. It's China. Well, you'd nearly be right. China's number 2 on the list. But who's at number 1? It's in actual fact an institution represented by Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell. It's not them who own the debt, it's the institution they work for or used to work for, which is of course the US Federal Reserve. That's the Central Bank of America. So while here in the UK we have the Bank of England, in America it's the Bank of America, the US Federal Reserve, the central bank. Now, where, and they own about a quarter of that debt, okay, so about $7 trillion worth of US debt is owned by the US central bank. The US central bank has lent the money to the US government. So where did the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, get the money from in order to lend it to the US government? They didn't raise taxes because they're not allowed to raise taxes. That's the government who raises taxes. The answer, funnily enough, will appear in the game of Monopoly. Now, Monopoly, invented in 1903, I believe, or 1933 by Lizzie Phillips to expose the iniquity of the capitalist system. But more importantly, the next time you play a game of Monopoly, get hold of the rule book. Because in the rule book, you will see a statement something like this. It says the bank never goes broke. If the bank runs out of money, it may issue as much as is needed by writing on any ordinary paper. That's from the rules of Monopoly, and that is another word for quantitative easing, effectively money printing. Now, it's not physical printing. They don't get the printing presses and actually physically print. They can, but this is an increasingly smaller part of our economy. So what they do is they just create money electronically. Okay, so if you think about it, it's a bit like you logging onto your bank statement and then just moving the decimal place a few zeros to the right, and suddenly you've got more money in your bank. Now, you're obviously not allowed to do that. If you try it, you'll go to jail. But if you're the central bank, you are allowed to do this. And suddenly the central banks are able to print money. Now, the first big piece of money printing happened in response to the global financial crisis. So as Lehman Brothers was collapsing, banks were going bust, nobody was lending to each other, it was causing absolute mayhem. The central banks printed money, they injected that money into the kind of the financial system, the financial heartache. And you may remember it was called a liquidity crisis, and a liquidity crisis is when there is no cash. They basically flooded the financial markets with money in order to keep the banks open, to keep people lending to each other, and to allow organizations to carry on doing business. Okay, and in response to the financial crisis, here we see on this chart the response from the Federal Reserve in red, the Bank of England in blue, the Bank of Japan is in green. That's a slightly different story, and the European Central Bank, the ECB, in yellow. All of them started to print money. So when they talk about central banks' balance sheets and their assets, effectively they're buying the debt. Don't forget, if I lend you money, your debt is my asset. So if I'm a central bank and you're an impoverished government, effectively what I do is I create this money out of thin air and then I lend it to you and you owe it to me. So it's my asset, it's your liability. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask for it back. In fact, if you want to pay interest, I'll just cancel the interest as well. So it's free money for you, which is a pretty good idea when you think about it. Okay, and so all of the central banks have been doing this in response to the global financial crisis. Very, very important that. Okay, So here we are now, and we're recording this in early 2021 as we're starting to hopefully get to the end of the pandemic of coronavirus, COVID-19. And in response to the coronavirus, the central banks also have been printing money. So what we see here from this chart is from 2007 to 2021, the main central banks, and in this case we're going to list the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan and the People's Bank of China, which is obviously a very, very big central bank. So the Bank of England unfortunately doesn't quite make it onto the table in this one because they're not big enough. So these are the major central banks, and all of them have been printing money. Now what's interesting about this chart is pretty much consistently there's a big spike around 2007, 8, 9 when they start printing money to deal with the first financial crisis, and then ever since then they've just been quietly printing money in the background. So they've still been printing money up until 2018, 2019, and then suddenly 2019, 2020 we get the financial crisis with the pandemic, and suddenly they just print money like it's going out of fashion. Look at the red line. The red line finishes at about 7 trillion. So we can see from the red line that the US Federal Reserve has lent $7 trillion to the US government. So as of today, about a quarter of the 28 trillion, so 7 out of 28, that's about 25%, has been lent by the US central bank that has created the money, bing, out of thin air. And if we add all of those together, what we see is that since 2007 to 2020, that the amount of debt, amount of extra money that's been created and pumped into the economy is a total of $23 trillion. That's a huge amount of money. That's a wall of money flooding into the economy. And if we remind ourselves, don't forget we said that if you increase the amount of money in the economy and the velocity stays constant, the Q also stays constant because that's our capacity to produce goods and services. Therefore, it has an inflationary effect. But we haven't experienced inflation. And so there's a lot of economists scratching their heads and thinking, hold on a sec, maybe this is no longer valid. Maybe this equation doesn't hold true anymore. Maybe we've entered into a new era. And maybe this is where modern monetary theory will work. And modern monetary theory, sometimes referred to as the magic money tree, basically says that you can print money from the central bank, you can give it to the government to spend how they see fit, and it's not going to cause inflation. So in the global financial crisis, they were printing money, they were giving it to the government was giving it to the banks. The government was actually injecting it into the banks and saying to the banks, you lend this out into the economy. But for the pandemic, for the coronavirus, they actually bypassed the banks. Think about the schemes that the governments around the world have been running, giving money to companies, giving money to individuals. They've actually been just crediting money straight into the banks of individuals. This is what's known as helicopter money. And they're all doing it, and they're saying, yes, but we can do it because it no longer has this inflationary effect, which is fantastic. So if you start to look at what's been happening in terms of this quantitative easing and what you start thinking is going to happen in the future, the governments are starting to believe that you can print money, you can inject it into the economy, and it's not going to create any inflation. Why not? Because we've been doing it for over 10 years and it hasn't happened yet. If you have too much debt, there's a number of different things you can do to resolve that situation. And exactly the same as what you can do to resolve a situation, so the government can also take a similar action if it has too much debt. The first thing you could do is to reduce your spending. So rather than going out and eating at nice restaurants, you can stay at home and eat bread and water. Cancel those exotic holidays and go camping for a couple of weeks. And exactly the same way, a government can embark on austerity. They can reduce government expenditure. The second option open to you is to get a pay rise, maybe get a second job, earn a bit more money, go and see your boss, ask for a pay rise. And the same that a government can do that through tax rises. They can increase the taxation in order to pay down that debt. You could work hard, get a promotion, work your way up through the organization and ultimately become a fat cat or an overpaid CEO of a multinational. And then the same option is open to a government. They could grow their economy and grow their way out of debt. If you think about it, if you have a worker on a low wage and they have $1 million mortgage, that's a bit of an issue. But if you have a CEO on a multi-million-dollar pay package, then their $1 million mortgage is less of an issue. And the final option to you is obviously to default. You just say, I'm really sorry, I can't pay my debts. And the same option is open to countries. They shouldn't really be doing this, but for example, Argentina does have a history of defaulting on its debt. Now, in terms of a country, there's a fifth option. Now, you and I can't do this, okay? So if we try this option, if we're caught trying it, we will go to jail. But as a country, as a government, you can, and it is, of course, to print more money. And by printing more money, you create inflation. And in effect, you inflate away your debts. So as we've discussed before, if you print more money, it creates inflation. Inflation debases the value of the currency, and therefore the value of the debt relative in that currency effectively goes down and goes away. However, before we embark on a process of inflation and printing money, we need to be careful that we understand the implications of inflation. And this is best summed up by John Maynard Keynes, who in 1919 said, by continuing a process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. So in effect, if you have $100 sitting in your bank account and it's been sitting there for a very long time, the purchasing power of that $100 has been reducing every single day. In effect, the government has been confiscating your wealth secretly and unobserved. Sounds good. But John Maynard Keynes goes on to say, by this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily. And while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. Those to whom the system bring windfalls become profiteers, who are the object of the hatred. The process of wealth degenerates into a gamble and a lottery. Lenin was certainly right, he explains. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all of the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. And I think that's a really interesting quote, because if you think about the extra $23 trillion that has been created by the central banks since 2007 in response to the global financial crisis, in response to the pandemic, and actually in the intervening period, you can start to think, well, what's the effect? It hasn't been inflation in terms of commodity prices, but that money has to go somewhere. And where's it gone? It's gone into asset prices. It's gone into real estate. It's gone into stock markets. It's gone into bond markets. So who are the people who benefit? Well, the people who benefit are the people who own those assets, the rich. And the people who don't benefit are the people who do not own the assets, the poor. And so what we see is, as a result of this extra money printing, the wealth inequality, which has been getting increasingly unequal since about the early 1990s, 1980s, is actually accelerating. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And if you start to feel that, it's very difficult to put your finger on it, But whether it's the Arab Spring in 2010, whether it's the Catalan separatist movement in the 2015-2016, whether it's the French Yellow Vest movement in 2018, or the storming of the US Capitol in 2021, you kind of get a sense that populist movements, while not directly linked to money printing, my personal belief is that the money printing that has been undertaken by the central banks is certainly lending fuel to that fire and having an indirect impact in the increase in populism that we've seen in the world around us. And if we're not careful with inflation, then inflation can get out of control. Now, you may remember we talked about the debt of the United States, and we concluded that the debt of the United States at the time of recording this was about $27.6 trillion, 27.6 trillion of these. But I, unbeknownst to you, can repay the debt of the United States today. And I can repay the United States today nearly 4 times over, because I have one of these, and this is effectively the result of hyperinflation. This is a $100 trillion bill issued by the Central Bank of Zimbabwe. And where did the Bank of Zimbabwe get the money from? They just printed it. They printed the money and they gave it to the Zimbabwean government. Now, when we think about it, that's quite interesting. So if you think about these two bills, we've got a dollar bill and a $100 trillion bill. Which do you think has the greatest purchasing power? Well, of course, you'd be right. It's the dollar bill. This actually has no purchasing power at all. It has a value as a souvenir, as an interesting artifact, effectively. And you can pick them up in markets and souks around the world. So let's look at the lessons from Zimbabwe in hyperinflation. In 2006, the inflation rate was estimated at 100,000%. By July 2008, that had increased to 2.2 million%. In August of the same year, it was 11.2 million%, and by October, it had reached 231 million%. According to Wikipedia, by the end, the interest rate was estimated to be 6.5 quintillion novemdecillion, effectively meaning that prices doubled every single day or every 1.3 days. Now that's incredible. That means that this can of Coke, if I buy it today for $1, tomorrow it's going to cost me $2. And then the day after that, it's going to cost me $4. And then 8, and then 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. You kind of think, hold on a sec, by this time next week, it's going to cost me $256. And it's going to continue to increase. That's just crazy. And if you want to know what it's like to live in that kind of environment, a friend of mine said that he used to live in Zimbabwe and he used to play golf on a Saturday morning with his friends. Nothing wrong with that. He said we'd turn up, we'd play 9 holes, we'd have a drink, we'd play another 9 holes. And he said things got so bad that they would turn up in the morning, and before they teed off, they would order their drinks and pay for them, because by the time they'd played 9 holes, the prices of those drinks had gone up. And you suddenly think that you can't live in an economy like that. And so if you remember our equation that says that if you increase the money supply and the velocity stays constant, then the prices will go up because the quantity has to stay constant. But if you increase the money supply and the velocity starts to increase, so this is effectively, if somebody pays you a Zimbabwean dollar, you need to get rid of it as quickly as possible. You can't wait until after the 9th hole to buy the drinks. You have to buy them before you tee off, and the quantity stays constant. Therefore, the price starts to go up exponentially, and that is where inflation turns into hyperinflation. And lessons in hyperinflation not only limited to Zimbabwe, we can go back in history to the Weimar Republic in Germany. So to pay for the debts of the First World War, Germany taken to the Treaty of Versailles and told they had to pay all of those debts, all the reparations. Now Germany, having just fought a war, had lots and lots of debt, and they said we can't afford it. And John Maynard Keynes says we shouldn't really be making them do that. But the rest of Europe said, no, we've got to make sure that Germany learns its lesson, and effectively made Germany pay for those debts. Well, Germany said we don't have the money, but we do have a printing press. And you could stand on the cobbles of the Bundesbank and you could listen to the rumbling of the printing machines in the vaults, and you could hear them printing the money day in and day out, night and day, 24/7. And it created inflation, and it created hyperinflation. And we had people like this gentleman who was pushing the wheelbarrow of his money down the street, and if he was robbed, people would take the wheelbarrow, tip the money out, and they'd steal the wheelbarrow because the wheelbarrow was worth more than the money. It led to the death of the Weimar Republic, a power vacuum, and we all know what happened next. And Germany, as a result, is very, very nervous of hyperinflation. Today, hyperinflation exists in one of the richest countries in the world. Venezuela, in terms of its natural resources, is one of the richest countries in the world, and yet their economy is a basket case. If you go to Venezuela, they don't count your money, they weigh it. Okay, and this is the result of hyperinflation. So hyperinflation, inflation and hyperinflation, is a little bit like toothpaste. It's very easy to get out of the tube. It's a little bit more difficult to get back in again. And in order to control inflation, the central banks use interest rates. And the last time the US experienced high levels of inflation was back in the early 1970s in the oil price shocks. And in response to that, the chair of the Federal Reserve at the time, that's Paul Volcker, he raised interest rates from 10 to 20% in 1 year to combat runaway inflation. Now think what your life would be like if interest rates suddenly had to go up to 20%. So far we've looked at how the currency of the past, so from the barter to gold, silver, and if you remember, Judas Iscariot was paid 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus, so this was a currency in the good old days, and how that has been replaced by our fiat currency of today. And maybe you're feeling a little bit nervous and you're thinking that the dollar bill should look a bit more like this, and there are some people who are starting to lose faith in it, and this is quite an interesting one. This is called the goldback. So whereas this is sometimes referred to as the greenback, the dollar, this is actually a goldback, and this is a piece of gold. This is 1/1000th of an ounce of gold, and it's printed onto a piece of plastic. So it actually bends up and I can put it into my wallet. This is issued in the state of Utah, and it's quite interesting. So this actually, it's $1,000. Here we go, put it the right way up. It's not $1,000. It's 1/1000th of an ounce of gold, and gold today trades at about $2,000 an ounce, which means that this has $2 worth of gold. So the inherent value of this is $2, and the theory is that you can take this into any shop and say, look, I've got $2 worth of gold, can I swap it for $2 worth of goods and services? And you don't have to depend on the US government owing you the money, because it's a physical metal. It's inherently backed. It's not even backed by the gold, it is the gold itself. So that's quite an interesting reaction to a lot of the money printing we've been seeing going on recently. However, I want to talk a little bit more about the future and fintech, and I want to start with the story of M-Pesa. Now, M-Pesa is a really interesting story. So M-Pesa is Africa's most successful mobile money service, and effectively what we found, or what they found, is that in Kenya people had their phones, and if I turned up at the roadside and I didn't have any money on me, but I wanted to buy a watermelon from a roadside stall, I could actually transfer credit from my phone to the person who was selling the watermelons, for example. So I can actually credit them, I can take my minutes and send it to them, and these minutes have value. And what we suddenly found through the M-Pesa was that actually people were using these minutes to transfer wealth between each other electronically. So they didn't need the actual physical currency as long as they had a mobile phone. And what we start to see through M-Pesa is that it shows us that whilst we need an electronic means of transferring wealth, we don't necessarily need banks to perform that function. You think about, for example, PayPal. Okay, the ability for us to transfer our wealth through PayPal or Revolut, for example. They're not actual physical banks, but they're a means of transferring wealth. Now, obviously with PayPal, we are transferring dollars or pounds or sterling or yen, etc., etc. But M-Pesa, you could actually transfer the minutes rather than the actual dollars, for example. So when we think about the world of FinTech, and FinTech is financial technology, so it's using technology for the financial world and financial services. So the world of FinTech is merely a natural extension of the modern world in which we live. We're very innovative creatures, and it's coming. We're just very, very innovative, and we're inventing these new ways of transferring wealth between you and me and using as a means of exchange. And it's coming, and whether we like it or not, FinTech is coming, and for some people it has actually arrived. And therefore cryptocurrency is merely a natural extension, just as this naturally turns into this, and this is becoming increasingly rare and is going onto our bank cards. So cryptocurrency is merely a natural extension of a means and mechanism for transferring wealth from one person to another. Now we're going to look at FinTech and cryptocurrencies, and when we talk about cryptocurrencies, there's lots and lots of cryptocurrencies out there. There's hundreds of currencies and tokens, and I'm not going to get into the detail of the specifications and the sort of advantages and disadvantages of each one. We are going to talk about Bitcoin because it's the biggest, it's the best known, but there are lots and lots of other cryptocurrencies out there. So let's just look at the difference between a fiat currency and the way a fiat currency is transferred and a crypto which is transferred on the blockchain. And in fact, Bitcoin sits on the blockchain, and other cryptocurrencies will use blockchain technology, and tokens will sit on top of that. Okay. Now, the first one is the fiat currency. Depends on a central bank. Okay, so we've talked about the Central Bank of America and the Central Bank of the UK and Japan and People's Bank of China, etc., etc. So we all need these central banks, and if I send you some money, I send it through my bank. So effectively my bank keeps a record of everybody's ledgers and who owns what and owes what, etc., etc. Okay. In the blockchain, this is decentralized. It doesn't sit in one place. It's everybody on the network sort of saying, yes, we all agree with each other. So it's very easy to hack a central bank because all you've got to do is get in through the front door. Now, when I say it's easy, it's not that easy because they invest in a lot of security to prevent you getting in. But it's very difficult to hack a decentralized network because you've basically got to hack everybody on the network all at the same time and change the ledger. You don't have to just hack into one bank account and change the number. You've got to hack into everybody's bank account all at the same time. And that's nigh impossible. HSBC will keep a private ledger, so our banks will keep, these commercial banks will keep a private ledger, so they know how much I've got in my bank account, and I know how much, but nobody else does. Well, the government obviously does, but nobody else knows how much is in my bank account. Whereas on the blockchain, it's a public ledger. Okay, so when there's a transaction, if I send you Bitcoin, it sits on this public ledger. We can see it. Everybody can see it. They can't see who I am because I'm in code, and they can't see who you are because you're in code, and they can't see how much was sent, but they can see the transaction. The string of code sits there on the public ledger. It's publicly available. And therefore, because we have this central bank, it's all about regulation and audit. We've got to regulate it, we've got to check it, we've got to make sure they've got systems and controls and processes and they're secure, etc., etc. Whereas on the blockchain, we don't need that because we've got independent verification. If I send you some Bitcoin on the blockchain, what I'm basically saying is I've sent some Bitcoin over here. Other people on the network are going, yep, no, we agree with that. Everybody in the network goes, yep, do we agree? Do we agree? Yes, we do. Bang. And then the blockchain actually is then immutable. It's created and it's immutable. And that transaction is then recorded in history. Whereas over here in our fiat currencies, I need to tell my bank to send you some money. My bank then talks to your bank and says, my person says that, they want to put money into your person's account, and then they talk to you to make, and there's lots of things that could go wrong in that kind of process. We depend on each of them having, good systems and processes. Nothing like that in the blockchain. And obviously fiat currencies, through fractional reserving, through quantitative easing, it's all about money creation. Whereas in the blockchain, certainly for Bitcoin, you can't create any more Bitcoin. There's about 18.5 million Bitcoins in circulation right now, and there's a maximum of 21 million. And when you hit the limit, that's it. There's no more. It's a bit like gold. There's only a finite amount of gold in the world. Some of it is underground, admittedly, and you need to mine it out. But once you've mined all the gold in the world, there is no more gold. So let's look at the history of Bitcoin. Bitcoin, born in about October 2008. It was a white paper written by an individual or group of individuals called Satoshi Nakamoto, who remain to this day a mysterious, unidentified individual. So nobody's actually confirmed their name. The first ever block was mined on the blockchain by Satoshi Nakamoto for 50 Bitcoins, and this was known as the Genesis block. And what's interesting about the Genesis block is it refers to the times on the day, and the times it refers to the 3rd of January 2009, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. Now, where did the Chancellor, this is the UK Chancellor, where did the Chancellor get the money for the second bailout of the banks, do you think? Well, you're now ahead of the game than most people. You know it was through quantitative easing. They just created the money and stuck it in the banks. Okay, so here is the actual blockchain itself. A lot of code. Now, I don't understand this code, and you probably don't understand this code, but it doesn't matter. We don't need to understand the code in exactly the same way that I don't know how the internet works. And you probably don't know how the internet works, but we know it works because we're using it. And you're probably watching this on the internet, and so we're harnessing the power of the internet without actually understanding the technology that sits behind it. Well, that's the way to think about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. You can harness the power of cryptocurrency. You don't necessarily have to understand the technology. Anyway, here is the Genesis block. It's a lot of code, lots of zeros and numbers and letters, and I have no idea what it all means, but what you can see, and I've highlighted it for you, is that quote that refers to the 3rd of January 2009 in the Times, and really refers to the ability of governments to create money out of thin air. So what is a Bitcoin? A Bitcoin is a unit of cryptocurrency, and it sits on the blockchain. So the blockchain is actually the technology that sits underneath a Bitcoin. Okay. New blocks are added every 10 minutes. So roughly what happens is that there's a transaction, there's lots of different transactions. This is all happening in the network. Everyone's looking at it. And then what we call the miners are they're trying to solve a problem. And when the first person to solve the problem says, I've solved the problem, we create the block, bang, that block is then is created. You can see it. It's there forever and ever and ever. You can see it on the internet, and it's immutable. And this happens about every 10 minutes. There's a maximum, as I mentioned, of 21 million Bitcoins, and they're expecting that we're going to reach that maximum round about the year 2140. So in effect, it's a bit like saying they're mining gold today. When are they going to have mined all the gold which is available to mine? That's kind of the similarity there. So Bitcoins, in exactly the same way, are created, and I use that in inverted commas, through mining. And the way that people mine them is that they are solving these problems, and every time they solve the problem, they create the next block, and they get awarded with a few Bitcoins. And this amount that they're given halves every 4 years. So effectively, it's making it increasingly scarce. So a little bit like mining for gold. In the early days of mining for gold, it's very easy. Think about the gold rush down to California. You find these nuggets lying in rivers, for example. But once everyone's picked up all the easy ones, then you need to dig down a little bit. And today, the only people who can really mine gold are the really big miners who dig very, very big holes and go all the way down and find their gold seams. So it's increasingly difficult to mine. And that's exactly the same as Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is sharing some very similar characteristics. You can't physically touch it. It's not like gold where you can actually say, I've got a piece of gold and put it in your pocket. It is a string of code, but it's finite, which is not like our cryptocurrency. So it is finite, and it's also increasingly difficult to get any more of. So to get more of these, if you're the US Federal Reserve, it's really very easy. You just type it into your computer. But if you're a miner for gold, it's very difficult. If you're a miner for Bitcoin, it's very, very difficult. So mining involves solving increasingly complex problems, which means it needs a lot of computing power. So you might read about stories about people who are they got server farms who are crunching these numbers and trying to solve these problems, and they get rewarded when they do. Of the first person to solve the problem gets the Bitcoin. So Bitcoin. Let's look at Bitcoin in terms of our 4 criteria of a currency, and in terms of that 4 criteria, you'll notice that I've tried to help you kind of remember those 4 criteria nice and easily. So the mnemonic of the first letters is, of course, cash. So can you create a Bitcoin? Well, the answer is no, you can't create a Bitcoin, and therefore I think we can give the creation a tick. Now, you can't destroy a Bitcoin, but you can lose a Bitcoin. Just like you can take this and you can drop it over the side of the boat and it can sink down to the bottom of the ocean and you'll never see it again. Exactly the same way you'll read about people who lost their keys or lost the password or dropped a hard drive into a bin, for example. Okay, but you can't create Bitcoin. You can mine it like gold, but you can't create it. Okay. What about its application? Well, hopefully you're going to agree with me that you can't use a Bitcoin for anything else. I mean, we talked about the industrial application of gold. You can't build a bridge from gold. It's too soft. The bridge would collapse and somebody would nick it anyway. You certainly can't build a bridge from Bitcoin. So it has no other application. It is only there as a currency. There's no other application for it. So we can tick that one as well. Come back to store of wealth in a minute. Let's look at homogeneous. Is it homogeneous? Is it fungible? Well, if I give you a Bitcoin and you give me a different Bitcoin, that's fine. A Bitcoin is a Bitcoin, so it's certainly homogeneous. And it's also divisible. So it's actually divisible down to 1 Satoshi. 1 Satoshi is 1/100 millionth of a Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin is trading, and today it's round about $30,000 when I'm recording this, you might think, I don't want to buy a Bitcoin, I haven't got $30,000. Well, it's not a problem. You don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin. You can buy a little bit of a Bitcoin. You can buy a Satoshi or a number of Satoshis. So a Satoshi as a unit of a Bitcoin effectively says that if a Bitcoin is worth $1 million, a Satoshi is worth 1 cent. So rather than thinking in Bitcoin, maybe we should actually think in Satoshis. We should be referring to Satoshis and talking Satoshis. Because, I'm going to buy something. I'm not going to buy a coffee for a bit of a Bitcoin, for example. I have to break a bit off, for example. I can just talk about, well, I can buy a coffee for 9,000 Satoshis, for example. And we can think about what that is actually worth. So, go back to our ticks. Is it homogeneous? Is it divisible? Absolutely, yes it is. So our last one is a store of wealth. Is it a store of wealth? Now we can get a little bit contentious here, and we hear a lot about people saying, oh, Bitcoin's in a bubble. And Bitcoin's in a bubble. Well, we've heard that one before. And what's interesting about Bitcoin being in a bubble is the definition of a bubble. Now, some people will say a bubble is merely a bull market where you don't have a position. So if you're in, you're saying it's a bull market, and if you're sitting on the sidelines and you think you've missed out, you say, oh, it's a bubble and it's all going to end in tears. And I've compared here, or I've got a chart here from Bank of America Merrill Lynch, who've compared lots of different bubbles in history. And they've looked at tulip bubbles in the Mississippi and the South Sea Company and gold and 1929, etc., etc. And what you see with bubbles is bubbles, they go all the way up and they come all the way back down again. And what's interesting about Bitcoin is that, yes, it has gone up and yes, it has come down, but it has come all the way down because it's kind of coming back again. And when I was sent this, there was a kind of question of like, well, what happens now? And I've circled the point at which I was sent it in red. And this was a while ago. And so if we look at where it is now, that red was actually that point there. So it went all the way up to $20,000 a Bitcoin. Everyone's going, oh, how can you pay $20,000 for a Bitcoin? It has no value. It's just a bubble, etc., etc. It's a string of code. And it came all the way back down again. And then it was on the way back up again, and then it did correct down again, and it carries on going up. Now, if you look at that and you think it's volatile, I'll admit that it is volatile. It's a very new technology. It's very, very new concept. People are nervous. They're like, oh, should I buy it? Should I not buy it? So it is very volatile, and we need, one of the things I need from this is I need stability. I need price stability. So it's not a really good currency right now it is too volatile. But what's interesting is that there's a trend upwards. If you look at that trend, there's a trend upwards. And if you go all the way back to the very beginning of this chart, you'll see a very little tick up. And actually, when that tick up first happened, that was a bubble. Okay, and everyone go, oh, there's a bubble. It went from $10 to $100. How could you pay $100 for a Bitcoin? Well, I reckon today you're thinking, if I'd have had the opportunity to buy $100 of Bitcoin, knowing what I know now, I'd have done it back in 2011, for example. So think about a Bitcoin. Bitcoin, it has been holding its value, despite the doomsayers, and there are constantly stories in the press saying that it's in a bubble and it's going to die. And the number of times that people have said that the Bitcoin is in a bubble and it's going to die is almost too numerous to count. Yet it's still there. It still has value. Yet I can tell you now that from history, the purchasing power of a dollar is going down. This has been going down. It will continue to go down. As the central bank continues to print these, it is losing its purchasing power. That is almost guaranteed. Now, I'm not going to guarantee a Bitcoin will go up in value, but I think that there's a higher probability that that will go down in value compared with Bitcoin going up in value, if that makes sense. So I reckon, based on that we can give a tick that it's a store of wealth. It may be very volatile and it may very well go to zero. Okay, so right now I'm not necessarily saying you want to bet your shirt. You don't want to do leverage bets. You want to sell your house and put it into Bitcoin. But there's an element that says it's been around for a long time. It's been around since 2009. It's 10 years old. It's still here, despite a lot of doomsayers. It kind of feels it's going to be here for a while. And it's also saying that if it's not Bitcoin, it's probably going to be one of the other cryptocurrencies, because there's a lot of cryptocurrencies out there. So, how do you know that this is genuine and not fake? Okay, well, you've got the watermark, you've got the very intricate detail, you look at the actual printing and the design. It's very, very intricate, and it's designed to make it very difficult for you and me to actually create one of these, which is obviously illegal. But the Bitcoin, you know it's genuine because it sits on the blockchain. If you can't find it on the blockchain, then it's not a genuine Bitcoin. So if you send me a Bitcoin, I can see that it's a genuine transaction because the code is there on the blockchain. How do you know how much money you have in your bank account? Well, you have to phone up your bank and you have to trust that they have got a proper record and that they haven't been hacked, and that they send you this information through your statement, and you probably keep a record and go, yeah, no, that's how much I thought I had in my bank account. On the blockchain, it's all there. It's immutable. It's in code. How do you know that if I make a payment to you that payment is actually correctly transferred? I rely on the banks and the centralized systems and processes that they have. But if I transfer a Bitcoin to you, it's on the blockchain. It's all done through this peer-to-peer network. How do I know that this will purchase $1 worth of goods and services? Well, I depend on you having faith in this and being able to accept it and then pass it on. And exactly same as a Bitcoin. All I need is for you to have faith in it, because if everybody has faith in it, it doesn't matter if I believe in it or not. If you believe in it, then it has value. And how do I know that the dollars in my bank account are mine? Well, that's a silly question because they are mine. But let's look at some experiences of capital controls. For example, Cyprus. In 2013, about 50% of deposits over $100,000 in Cypriot bank accounts were seized. The country was basically bankrupt. In order to bail itself out, it froze all the bank accounts, and then it said, if you've got 200,000 euros in your bank account, basically we're just going to take the top 50 euros. Sorry, nothing you can do about it. That's pretty scary, isn't it? Blockchain, they can't do that, because in the Bitcoin, they don't have access to be able to access your account directly. Similarly, in Greece in 2015, they had to impose capital controls. They had to restrict people to taking out 60 euros per day. And there were controls on international transfers. You couldn't get your money out of Greece. They imposed these capital controls, and this was as a result of the Greek debt financial crisis. Okay, blockchain it's outside of the reach of the governments. They can't actually access it. They can't impose capital controls. They can't effectively just give you a haircut and take money out of your bank account. Now, a lot of people look at me and say, well, you know, Bitcoin, you can't see a Bitcoin. At least I can see a dollar. Well, yes, this isn't actually a dollar. This is a pretty pictures on a piece of paper or a piece of cotton, as we discussed. This represents a dollar. It's just an IOU. It really has no more value than one of these, only obviously this is backed by, well, our friend who is a mythical person, and this is backed by the US government. So as long as you believe the US government, then this will have value. So Bitcoin, the fact that you've never seen a Bitcoin, I don't think that's really a good argument. And then I think to myself, well, I've never seen an air mile. I know it has value because I use them in order to, you know, buy trips for my family when we go on holiday. I've never seen it. I've seen a statement with them on, but I've never seen a physical air mile. Here in the UK, we have something called Nectar Point. I've never seen a Nectar Point. I have a card, I have a loyalty card, and it credits Nectar Points when I you know, buy my shopping, and I can use it to buy stuff. But I've never actually physically seen a Nectar Point. So we need to be careful that we don't get drawn into that because I can't see it, it doesn't exist. It does exist, it exists in string of code, and you can see a Bitcoin. The transactions sit on the blockchain. Okay, you can see them if you're interested, but it's just a string of code. So as I mentioned, blockchain, there's lots of different cryptocurrencies out there, and blockchain may not be the one that actually wins. So when we think about the bubbles, think about the, you know, the railway bubble, for example. You know, the move west in America, people putting down railways, lots of companies putting down railways, most of them went bust. And the ones that didn't go bust, who were strong enough, bought all the ones that did go bust, but the infrastructure had been laid. And therefore America thrived because of that massive investment in infrastructure. Tulips, you know, the tulip bubble, massive tulip bubble. But if you buy tulips today, where do you buy them from? Holland, because the infrastructure was laid. Think about the TMT, the technology bubble of 2000. The technology bubble, massive amount of investment in technology, lots of companies go bust, and who wins? Well, people like Facebook, founded in 2003, coming out of the ashes of the original bubble, and they were able to leverage the infrastructure that had been laid as a result. So maybe Bitcoin isn't going to be the winner. Maybe Bitcoin is going to be Facebook. Maybe Bitcoin's going to be Amazon. Maybe Bitcoin's going to be MySpace or the original Boohoo.com who collapsed. So maybe it's not going to be the one that actually wins. Maybe one of these other ones is going to win. I don't know. Who knows the answer to that? But the point, I believe, is that whatever does win, crypto is here. It's part of our lives. It's going to become an increasingly part of our life. And you've really got two options. You can either sit on the sidelines and say, no, it's nothing to do with me, or you can get involved and you can have a go. And it's really very easy. You've got to set up a wallet over here using one of the online wallet spaces, set up a wallet over here, buy a few bits of Bitcoin, buy a few Satoshi, you know, $100, don't bet the bank, buy a little bit, transfer it to this wallet over here, and then transfer it back again. And once you've done that, and you can see those transfers on the blockchain, you're part of the revolution. And at least you're in the game, you understand it. So I would suggest that you don't dismiss something that you haven't actually tried. Here's blockchain, the market capitalization of blockchain. Now that previous slide I showed you that the Bitcoin, the biggest currency by market capitalization, it's about $600 billion in market capitalization. Now when I was sent this chart by Blocked Out Capital, you can see that blockchain, Bitcoin, sorry, I'm using Bitcoin and blockchain interchangeably. So Bitcoin was sitting down at about 183 billion, something like that. Well, today's valuation at the time of recording this, about $600 billion, puts it in terms of a global currency somewhere up there. That's ahead of the Indian rupee, ahead of the Saudi rial, for example, ahead of the well, you can see that, the Singapore dollar. So, some fairly established currencies there. Up at the top, the biggest currency by market cap is the yuan. You kind of expect that. It's the biggest global trading bloc in the world. The United States dollar, very, very just behind. The euro, and the dollar has been painted green just to show you that this is the world's reserve currency. So, I can use this in pretty much any country in the world. My pounds are less acceptable. The euro is obviously big. The yen, Japan, very, very big economy. Gold is number 5, and then pound sterling, the good old mighty British pound, slightly fallen off its perch, quite significantly below gold. And then we list other currencies further down. So Bitcoin, if it's actually going to be put on a currency, it's sitting somewhere halfway in this table. And we think about the potential of cryptocurrencies. So you may have read recently about Facebook and their potential cryptocurrency of Libra. Now, Facebook are starting to think about this cryptocurrency. The time of recording, they've kind of shelved the plans. I think they've got a few regulatory issues with social media that they kind of need to sort out before they start upsetting people by launching their own cryptocurrency. But when you think about Facebook, if you think about a market such as, I don't know, India, for example, and you think about the success of the M-Pesa, think about today and how many people in India have a Facebook account, and how many people don't have a bank account, and how many people both have a Facebook account but no bank account. And if you have a Facebook account and I have a Facebook account and neither of us have a bank account, maybe Facebook has an opportunity, a cryptocurrency, for us to transact between each other using something like the Libra, for example. Okay, so the potential here is massive. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but we're starting to see ourselves moving in that direction. And that's effectively where the world is going. So just as we have evolved as humans, from the apes through Darwinism, and we're continuing to evolve, so we're seeing the currencies are evolving from this, our silver and our gold. And I don't think we're going to go back to that. I don't think that's going to catch on. We're not going to go backwards in evolution. We're not going to go back to the gold standard. This is the currency of today. Here it is. But the currency of the future is going to be electronic, and crypto is an electronic currency. And it's just a natural extension of the way that we can store and transfer our wealth. So there we've looked at the history of money. We've looked at money from the barter economy through to fiat currencies and the importance of trust in fiat currencies. We've looked at how commercial banks can create money, how central banks create money, fractional reserving and quantitative easing, and the implications, inflationary implications of that money creation. And then we've started to consider the role of cryptocurrencies and how cryptocurrencies really represent the natural evolution, the natural future of currencies. We might go back to this, but I'm not sure that something like this is ever really going to catch on. I think the money of today is going to start to move to the natural extension to the money of tomorrow, to cryptocurrency. Now you might be sitting there thinking, actually, Ted, I'm really nervous about this. You're undermined everything that I believe in. This has no value, and you're actually thinking you're going to invest in shotguns. You're going to buy some baked beans, transfer your money to gold, and then you're going to head for the hills and wait for Armageddon. And if you were to think like that, it'd be understandable, but you'd be what's known as a prepper. And a prepper is somebody who prepares for the end of the world. And I think you'd be wrong. You certainly wouldn't be the first prepper. There's been people all the way through history who've expecting the end of the world. And guess what? They've always been wrong. In fact, do you know who the earliest prepper is? The first recorded prepper ever? You've definitely heard of him. It was, of course, Noah. Noah built a boat on top of a mountain. And everyone goes, why would you be building a boat on top of the mountain? That's crazy. Even today, we don't build boats on tops of mountains. We build them by the sea. But Noah goes, aha, I've seen the future. I know what's coming. Well, it was a big flood, but we're still here and we're still continuing to evolve. So what we see is that actually, I think that as humans, we're incredibly innovative. We're very, very good at adapting, surviving, and cryptocurrency is merely a natural extension of that adaptation. So just as the delinking of the currency from the gold standard in 1971 was the bell was rung by the doomsayers saying that's it, the world's going to collapse, we're all going to kind of go backwards, back to the Middle Ages. We haven't done that. We've continued to evolve. I'm not saying it's a straight line and that it's been plain sailing. There's problems, there's always problems, but we as human beings are very good at innovating, adapting, and overcoming that. So I personally have a huge amount of faith in the human race, the ability to meet the challenges of the future, and I also believe fundamentally that cryptocurrency has a fundamental role to play at the heart of our economy. So thank you very much for your attention to these videos. I hope you found them really useful and informative, from barter to fiat and crypto. I'm on LinkedIn if you want to stay in touch with me. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm very easy to find. You can either go through my website and contact me, or you can find me on LinkedIn.